Welcome to everybody for attending to this important work that we're going to be doing. Some of you may be wondering or pondering of what your role in this project will be. How do I fit in? Am I just coming to steering committee meetings? So Tony will explain to you later. If you have an idea how you might fit in, great. We have some ideas on how each of you might fit in, but Tony will explain how nobody's just here to twiddle their thumbs, hopefully. Although I suppose theoretically, if you want to twiddle your thumb, who am I to stop you? But Tony will explain the process later on, where we will be reaching out to each of you to try to determine a specific role for you in this project. And the only other thing that I have for now is I hope some of you saw, I sent you a draft of the K-12 Universal Curriculum Design principles that the State Department of Ed created. That is a draft document and may or may not be useful to our work. But I thought since it had just been released as a draft, that we might want to take a look at it and see if there's anything there that is useful to us. Tony, take it away.
All right, thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen again. I just want to go over the agenda just really briefly, and then my whole thing today is really to review the overview of the project, just so everyone's on the same page. So thank you for Steve for opening us up and welcoming us. Today's agenda really has to do with, I'm going to go over the project overview. We have some research assistants, 4 of them that did some inquiry into standards across the country. One of them are going to report today, Ian McGregor. And then we have several presentations on standards in Connecticut, what that looks like. And then we're going to talk about what our next steps are. So that's our overview for the agenda for today. Coming up next, this is the partnership timeline. I went over this last time. I'm not going to go over in too in depth today, just because just in the essence of time here. But really we are in the first stage and the second stage kind of at the same time concurrently. We are assembling the team and defining the purpose. That's what we're working on now. That's a major part of what today's presentation is. We're also building the survey to assess the needs that will be going out shortly. We're going to be surveying stakeholders, so people all across Connecticut. Thank you for the people that submitted some questions last time. We're going to be working on that and getting that together in the next couple of weeks or so. Then we're going to be drafting the standards. And that process is going to take a couple months. We're going to have some time for public comments. We're going to revise and submit the standards. You'll notice that the final draft is due on May 9th with it's submitted to the Connecticut State Department of Education on June 1. So we have a very, very tight timeline. And then we start the rollout, which would be 60 hours of workshops. That's when the K model curriculum work will begin. And then we'll have some additional workshops throughout the next couple of years or so. So what does that mean for the steering committee? For the steering committee, there are 6 scheduled meetings. I can imagine maybe sneaking in 1 or 2, maybe 1 or 2 more on top of this, but we've already had the first meeting, which was November 3rd. Really, the objective was to define our, to kind of introduce the project and provide an overview. The next meeting, which is today, November 29, which is the purpose here is to understanding what works for standards. We're going to be having the research assistant report and standards in Connecticut. Then we're going to be moving on to developing our guiding principles. That's going to be the week of December 13th to the 13th, the 14th, or 15th. There will be a doodle poll that goes out so we can pick the best date for folks. And then in early January, we're going to begin to chart our course. So you see there's a lot of work up front. The first several meetings are within the first 2 months or so. And then the next meeting for the steering committee won't be until after the first draft of the standards are complete. We'll have a protocol to do some feedback. We'll do some whole group reflection. I probably should have put some action planning on there, maybe some marching orders for the writing groups. And then the work will continue, and we'll have another meeting in April, early to mid-April, where we'll go through the process again so that we can get ready for the final draft which again will be submitted in May. So again, we have a tight timeline. So yes, we do have several steering committee meetings up front, but then there's going to be a large gap where there's going to be writing going on. And I could see some folks from this steering committee helping with the writing, right? So that's why there's a lot of different roles and facets that we're going to need help with. So that's why it's going to be really important for us to figure out what those might be. I think Steve might have a comment.
And Tony, I think that's also why these first 3 meetings, this is information that we're providing in these first 3. So no matter what your role is, we want you to have this. No matter what your role in this process is, the stuff that we think that we're doing the first 3 meetings is crucial stuff for everybody to know.
Yeah, I mean, the guiding principles and the kind of setting our course are going to be the most important meetings. And the work that we do in this group is going to guide all of the rest of the work that we do for the remainder of the time.
Recording in progress.
I also wanted to go over just a little bit more about roles. So the steering committee really has to do with setting a path for the project and reviewing progress over time. We're going to be hiring a project manager. A pretty nice amount of money has been set aside, or we're working on securing the funding for a project manager to be hired. That's a 2-year position, helping with the standards projects and some other related initiatives. We have 4 project associates, which I'll get into who those people are in just a moment. And we have also 4 research assistants, and we're going to be seeing some of the work that the research assistants have done in the presentation to follow. So here are the folks. We have the project associates. We have their names listed here. I'm not going to go through and list everyone's name and what have you, but I would say that we have practitioners from the field. We have people at the university level. We have people that are administrators. We have folks that are in the classroom. And then we also have our research assistants here. And you can see this project associates are going to be helping us with stewardship of specific aspects of the standards development. There's a stipend to cover their work. Actually, there's stipends for all of the work that we're going to be doing. I mean, you probably won't be able to retire afterwards, but it's definitely meant to compensate at least some of your time. And then we also have research assistants who are also getting a stipend, and you can see that they are doc students and postdoc students. So just people that are really geared towards the research, and they're going to be helping us execute tasks to support the overall functioning of the project. All right, so that really is my overview. I'm going to kick it over to Ian McGregor in just a moment for the research report. So basically, they looked at standards from all across the country, and really they were looking at the work that was done by the Fordham Institute, where they did a review of standards across the country. So they were looking at that, and then they looked at the top 4, and that was the document that I had sent out prior to this meeting. So with that, I'm going to stop my sharing, and we're going to turn that over to Ian.
Thanks, Tony. Let me share my screen. All right, should be able to see this now.
Yep, it's great.
Cool, awesome. So hi everyone, Ian McGregor, a postdoc fellow at the Human Rights Institute at UConn. Myself, Katie, Sarah, and John, the 4 of us were tasked with, as Tony said, looking at some states across the United States and how they are executing, social studies standards. We looked at the top 4 that the Fordham Institute ranked as being the top, states, although one of them is not a state, DC. And the Fordham Institute has its issues, let's say, as we addressed, and I think the executive summary that Tony sent out to everyone. And my purpose here today is not to get into those nitty-gritty issues, but kind of highlight some of the things that these other states are doing. Stuff that some of it's good, some of it's bad, some of it's just noteworthy. So we'll go from there. So just to summarize again, the 4 standards we looked at Massachusetts social studies standards, Alabama social studies standards, DC, and then the California social studies frameworks. California social studies standards are almost over 20 years old now, I guess. And so we focus more on the framework side because those are newer. Katie, Sarah, and John couldn't make it today, so I'm flying solo. So I'll try to answer any questions you have about the states that I didn't particularly look at because we all chose a state. But we'll go from there. So let's jump into it. So the organization of this PowerPoint, we're first going to dive into how each one's organized and some of the highlights there, and then content and how each of these states organize the content, and then looking how they incorporated multiple narratives. So organizational highlights and examples. First thing, and again, I'm going to go ahead and say this up front, is that none of this is to suggest that this isn't already incorporated into the Connecticut frameworks. It's just something that we thought may have been good, noteworthy, or bad. Don't do it. We'll have some non-examples. But one of these is those supporting questions, right? And I know in this Connecticut frameworks there are supporting questions, but the Fordham Institute was very high on the inclusion of supporting questions. We were as well. So we see this a lot in these top tier social studies standards. So Massachusetts, obviously, what does it mean to be responsible? California had these guiding questions for each grade level. So here we see grade 4 with 3 guiding questions. There were some of these states use organizational graphics to help get across ideas. So all these states focused on, for the most part, 4 strands of social studies: economics, geography, history, and civics. This mirrors the C3 frameworks. And Sarah really liked this really goofy graphic that looked like it came out of 1998 Windows graphic designer or something. So, but we see these 4 strands get repeated over and over within each grade level, and again, really mimicking the C3 frameworks. A big thing that we really appreciated was clear organization. The Fordham Institute really knocked Connecticut for how the frameworks are organized. And so we were looking at how these other states were organizing themselves. Alabama has this little grid that has codes where it's very clear and accessible in terms of what is being covered by these standards. So by this standard, we see economics, geography, and history is being covered. District of Columbia also has something very similar, where they use a coding system. They go a little bit further than just those 4, geography, economics, whatnot, and incorporate other things like social impact events, military action, intellectual thought. But again, using a coding system to help keep things organized and what the standards are addressing. Some of these states, and DC is one example, use some core concepts as guiding principles. These also was a thread that was carried through all the standards, right? It was obviously mentioned at the very top, but it was something that was rarely brought up and referenced over and over again throughout the entire standards document. And then we see, the banding of grade levels in regards to, historical thinking skills or what content should be covered. So in DC, we see historical thinking skills getting banded K2, 3, 5, 6, 8, and then 9, 12. California does something similar in terms of banding skills and what should be covered, what should be focused on. So we have a little bit different though, K5, 6, 8, 9, 12. So that's something we might want to think about. Is the banding of skills and what grade levels they should focus on. And here again, there's something I want to highlight is that some states focused on skills that are cross-disciplinary, like literacy. So California is really big on how do you incorporate literacy skills into the social studies. But also we see the typical things that we're familiar with: content, inquiry, and citizenship. Other things that we thought were really great were classroom lesson examples. So some of the states, as you were reading the standards and going through, they might throw up, here's an example of how this standard might look like in your classroom, right? So here we have a kindergarten classroom example of what does it mean to be a good citizen, what this fictional Miss Miller might do in her classroom, what questions she might be asking, what resources she might incorporate, like the picture book No David. So there's all these supports in all 4 of these states. There are supports kind of throughout the standards to help people, practitioners reading this, to help them think about what might this look like in my classroom. I'm reading the standard, but this is I don't want this to be nebulous. Like, what does this look like in my classroom? And so California is a great example of trying to show what it might look like in your classroom. And then again, part of that support was glossary related resources, appendices. All 4 of these states were very big on that. I think California had like 8 appendices. DC has a glossary of terms, as well as related resources. I'll show some other examples later on. But all these states were very good about just like naming, here's some resources, here's some links you can go to right now to get more information on whatever this topic is, whatever the skill is, so on. Content highlights and examples. So again, the integration of skills and dispositions into each grade level. Like I said, that thread is pulled through throughout the standards. It's not something that is mentioned once in introduction and disappears. It is reoccurring. So this is an example from Massachusetts. Again, the use of appendices and primary source material. So here's a great example from Massachusetts. Here's the standard, describe the Constitutional Convention, so on and so forth. But then it gives you some primary sources, some examples that you can pull from. It gives you an appendices that you can reference. That, as a former practitioner, like that's very nice and easily accessible to get in more information. So instead of having to go find it myself, that it's there, it's readily available. Here's some non-examples though. This comes from DC. So sentences seem overly prescriptive. Anything that seemed prescriptive, we knew that wouldn't fly in Connecticut, right? Given that everything is very local, it's not centralized at the state level. We understood that things like, students have to say, my grandma used to walk with a cane, now she's in a wheelchair. That's overly prescriptive, and that's not going to fly in Connecticut. The Fordham Institute seemed to rank high on things that are more prescriptive, as well as things that were more content-based than skill-based. But as we mentioned in the executive summary, that isn't something we knew that was something that wouldn't go well in Connecticut. So this is a great example of a non-example, something that we hope that the steering committee moves away from or stays clear of. Here's another non-example. California's framework uses an expository approach, in which it's basically a giant textbook. The entire thing is over 500 pages. Here's a summary of history, basically. And it comes across, again, very prescriptive in terms of like, here's the history, here's how you're supposed to understand it and analyze it, and not deviate from these narratives in any kind of way, right? Here is the prescribed narrative that you need to adhere to. And then within that expository approach, there were also these prescriptive methods that I personally found odd. So, the teacher has students meet together in groups to discuss the question and use their notes to make a T-chart. So here within this expository approach of here's the narrative of history, but also here's how you're supposed to teach it down to the daily lesson. Which, if as a former practitioner reading this, I would scoff at someone telling me exactly how I have to teach the Roman Empire on any given day. Something we also really appreciated, and this comes from DC, is a wide range of example suggestions. And we saw this in Massachusetts as well. So, we're asking students to understand the importance of individual action and character. So here's a list that you can choose from, but also go find your own individuals that you want to focus on, giving teachers that wide range of choice and agency to conduct the content and teach the skills that they feel is needed. And as you can see, it's very diverse. It's not focused on white men from colonial era. It spans across U.S. history, and it's a diverse group of people. And something that's noteworthy was, the Fordham Institute focused very heavily on US history and civics. It didn't really get into world history or geography. But something we did notice was that in most of these standards, a lot more content specificity when it came to US history and civics than it did when it came to world history or geography or economics. Economics, is not covered extensively at all. But when you look, like, this is a great example from DC, where a lot of specificity when it came to US history, especially things like the American Revolution or World War II. But when you look at ancient classical civilizations, it's a lot more sparse. And then multiple narratives of history standards examples. So again, going back to the idea of providing multiple options for teachers to provide that agency. So there's intentionality there, right, to include diverse subjects and suggested list of peoples and events. Again, we saw this in Massachusetts, we saw this in DC a lot. California, it was there, it was just hard to find because of the expository approach. Asking students to examine bias was something that we also found pretty prevalent in these state standards, to move away from that singular narrative and understand their own biases they might have, their own point of view. And then recognition of diverse social justice leaders. All these states were pretty good about addressing other narratives that that have. Let me back up. California, for example, has laws mandating that LGBTQ history, for example, be included in the social studies classroom. So similar to some of the mandates we're seeing here in Connecticut, all these states were really good at addressing those and incorporating them into their standards. And then again, the building on top of this is, the intentionality. So not just including historical figures, but also including cultural aspects of these other narratives. So, including the Black National Anthem as something that needs to be covered and taught about. And then attention to teaching controversial topics. So California had this appendix on how do you incorporate, how do you teach about religion, right? If you're teaching world history and you're teaching about the Protestant Reformation, that's a controversial topic, talking about religion in the classrooms. How do you attend to this? And so, the next few pages are some of the legal aspects of it and what you can and cannot do within the state of California, but also just some practitioner-based things on what you can and cannot do or attempt to do. So methodological models that you could use to teach and incorporate religion into your classroom. So in conclusion, the list of examples that allowed for teacher freedom and choice. This is something we really appreciated. Images and visual aids, supporting questions. And again, that's something I know we have in the Connecticut frameworks. Integrated content and learning from multiple subject areas. Like I said, California's inclusion of literacy skills. Those supports in regards to appendices and resources, model lessons, primary sources. That was something that we saw a lot of and we really appreciated. Clear and accessible guiding beliefs and theoretical framework. So like looking at the DC's 10 principles, user-friendly organization. So again, that coding sequence made it very easily to follow. And then that intentional inclusion of diverse voices, right? So being intentional about that, not just tacking it on, but actually being really intentional about how we incorporate that. So I know Tony and Steve earmarked about 30 minutes for me to present this. Well, obviously that didn't take 30 minutes. So I welcome any questions that anybody might have about this. I'll try to do my best to answer about the states I didn't focus on, but yeah.
Thank you so
Ian,
much.
could I ask a question? We're always trying to ask, where's the sweet spot where it gives people enough to work with, but it's not oppressive, if you know what I mean. Do you think any of these specifically meet that spot?
Yeah, I would think Massachusetts and DC do, right? Alabama seems too sparse and California seems too heavy-handed. But it seems like Massachusetts and DC hit this sweet spot of here's some content, here's some choice within that content. Here's some references, here's the specific core principles it might be attending to. It's organized in that way. But I think those two states in particular do a really good job of providing that choice and agency within the content, the standards they're asking teachers to follow.
Mhm. We can open up to the group now if anyone has questions.
Did you, in your travels, sort of look at any of the implementation supports that the states provided? I know the standards themselves are part of the work of this group, but was there in the appendices or anything that you looked at any kind of implementation cycle plan that was outlined?
No, that's, think about how I want to say this. California was very heavy-handed in that they wanted everybody to follow a script, right? And so in that sense, yes, because it was throughout the whole thing, as I showed, right? Like, here's what teachers are going to do to teach the Roman Empire. They use a T-chart. But the other states, other than providing resources, primary resources, not really, right? And I think there's a middle ground, like Steve's getting at, between the heavy-handedness of California and then providing nothing in terms of here might what a model lesson might look like, right? California was good about providing some of those model lessons, but also simultaneously being very heavy-handed. It's an odd document.
All right.
Yeah, Ian.
Go ahead.
Hi. So Ian, I still remember my first time walking into a history classroom over 20 years ago and asking, where's the textbooks? And they said, well, there isn't textbooks. There's a drawer over there that the former teacher used to work out of with pamphlets and other wonderful things. And, it seems to me, especially for younger teachers or teachers early on, they need something concrete, not ideas and I won't say random, but not ideas and documents to work on. So, it almost seems like, the best of all possible worlds would be a very kind of a California type curriculum that could be modified or could be expanded on, or, a teacher could, as we would say, dig our own post holes or something like that, versus having something that's very open. And then for the new teacher, there's no, so we say we need to provide structure to the students, but we're not providing, maybe enough structure to teachers, not imagining the teachers who've been doing it for 20 years, but imagining the teacher who comes out of a Neag program or another program in Connecticut with really, a blank piece of paper. And this is what the guy before you did. And I think that's worrisome. The second is that we used to, back in the day, go away to workshops and they would give us a curriculum or a unit to bring back with us. So when I was a science teacher, we would go and do a unit on density and bring it back and do that unit in the classroom, or Bristol Myers gave us like the Smithsonian, I used to be a science teacher too, but they would give us a Smithsonian kit and you followed it by, they gave you the materials, they gave you the chemicals, they told you how to use it and when to use it. And then we turned around and used it. And it was wonderful because you didn't have to, as a science teacher, create your own, complex experiment. They did it for you. So in a sense, we're asking our social studies teachers, here are the materials, create your own complex experiment and see how it works out. So
Yeah,
I guess those are my comments on this.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think, like I said, I think DC and Massachusetts do a really good job of, here's the standard, but also signaling where you could go with that standard, right? So if you're like, I read the standard, it doesn't mean I'm a third grade, teacher. I don't have a background in social studies. I'm reading this standard and I don't know where to go with it. I don't know what to teach. And like Massachusetts have, like, here's a list of it, examples that would meet the requirement of the standard. And here's some primary sources. And then something maybe to include as appendices is here's model lessons, here's a model curriculum to follow. But it gives the teacher agency whether they want to use that or not. Whereas California is, that heavy-handedness saying like, nope, this is it. So I like that. I like that. And I'm speaking for myself and the three other research assistants, as we talked about this extensively. We were all former practitioners, and we like that idea of like, oh, these are some signposts I can follow. I can choose which road I want to, choose your own adventure, so to speak. That meets the requirement of that standard. And if I need more support, that it should be there. I should be able to click a link that drops me down to an appendices or something that gives me a model lesson to follow, because I am a 4th grade or 3rd grade teacher, and I don't have that background in social studies. I got my background in reading. And so I think that was something we would encourage Connecticut to do, is have those models, it was exemplars, for example, lessons or curriculum to follow if it's needed. It's not prescriptive, but it's just another support to have.
Fantastic. We're going to go to Jason Chang. He's had his hand up, and then there's a couple questions in the chat we'll get to next. Go ahead, Jason.
Cool. Thanks, guys. Ian, thank you for the report. That was really fascinating to see the comparisons and the examples. Maybe this is anticipating the future work we'll do, but was wondering if you saw in your in your study of these different state standards, how did they sort of wrestle with coverage of, say, a standard that was looking at, say, experiences of racism, but then the examples maybe have, are, a selection of, say, like African-American experiences, Asian American experiences, Native experiences, right? And that it was the standard broken down into, say, like, these are African-American studies standards, these are Native studies standards within it, so that, say, you have a standard, but then the choice within it is maybe one of a number of options, right? And so, is there a way that, if there was, say, like a standard on immigration that looked at push and pull factors, that could say there's some, a geographic standard for, the Pacific, a geographic standard for the Caribbean, for the Atlantic, right? Or is having other kinds of breakdowns in terms of how a standard is sort of looked at in terms of the content delivered. So I don't know if that was clear or not, but.
Yeah, I think I'm getting at, I understand what you're getting at. And I would say that it's not broken down in that way in any of the state standards. Some states are better about being intentional about including it, but it is just like thrown up there with everything else. It's not organized in the way that you're suggesting. And I think that is a very interesting way of including, to structure and organize the state standards. And I'm thinking about, like, I think it was Massachusetts or DC's, one of the two. They were at times trying to be very intentional about inclusivity, but at other times, like when they bring up like Native Americans, it was very broad. There's no specificity there. And even when, like, some of the examples I gave, right, there's no specificity with that inclusion, right? So even though they're trying to be intentional about being inclusive, there's that lack of specificity I think you're suggesting might be needed. So
we do have to move on pretty quickly. There was a quick question, it seemed like, in the chat, and I do want to get to Mary because she has her hand up. Just really quickly, did anyone speak to the number of standards by grade level? Was there any indication of that?
No, it ranged, right? It definitely got there could be more standards, obviously, the higher up the grade level you went, but it ranged anywhere between 5 standards to 12 standards. When I was looking at California, I can't speak to the other ones because I didn't dive that deep into those states, but California, had the frameworks and standards. Their standards are very, very vague, but it ranged from 5 to 12. And again, those were written in 1996 or 97, whereas Massachusetts are a lot newer, DC is a lot newer too, but I can't speak to those states.
Great. And Mary, just quickly, because we do need to move on.
Yeah, I was just curious about the audience because I think we were vacillating back and forth. It sounded like with comments that we're still directing these to a district who then makes district decisions based on these parameters, right? So an individual practitioner, if I'm a second grade teacher, I'm not necessarily going rogue. I'm still aligning with my district because this is a total document and I'm going to do that within the confines of my district, right? That's still our audience at this point.
I think that's a really great question. And I think when we get into charting our course, we're going to decide that. But yeah, I'm pretty sure that I think Steve could speak to this better than I can, but I think that's the intent, what you just said.
Of the goal usually of a framework or standards document is to inform people who are making curriculum decisions at the school or district level. I think the number of could a teacher get something out of this? Absolutely. But I'm not sure that a teacher is usually a teacher is not the major audience of a document of this nature.
Okay, so again, thank you so much to Ian and the research assistants for putting together that wonderful presentation and helping to put together the executive summary that was in the research report. If you haven't checked that out, please do. And now we're going to kick it over to Steve because we have some additional presentations about standards in Connecticut.
Sure. A colleague that I've worked with for ages, the last time we did this, he was a giant, but it was Alan and Alan Marcus from UConn, and he's going to make a few comments about the use and misuse of social studies standards. Go ahead, Alan.
Thanks, Steve. Let me start. I think I know about 2/3 of the people here. If you don't know me, my name is Alan Marcus. I'm a professor at the University of Connecticut. I'm a former high school teacher. And, Steve, when you start getting emails from Steve, they pop up and the first thing, before you even read it, you just know that's going to take some time. Whatever it is, he's asking you to do something. So that's part of this work, I think. Steve asked me if I would just talk a little bit about the big picture of standards and writing standards. So I'm not going to take long. I'm just going to share a few ideas, not for us to not to solve right now, but I think a number of things that we're going to need to talk about. And some of them have already, were already just brought up in the last couple of minutes, like who's the audience and things like that. So Steve was just addressing this, sort of what's the purpose of standards and how are they used? So sort of broadly, standards have been used by states across the country, primarily to provide guidance for districts on what to teach, but also to dictate content to be covered for a statewide test or assessment. So that we haven't talked about that, and my understanding is that's not on the agenda for Connecticut, but that is a typical use of standards. To create consistency across districts, and there was a comment, I think I saw a comment on the side about the idea of what are we doing when kids are moving districts, are they able to go from one district to another and have some consistency? So that's another potential purpose. To determine what knowledge and skills are most valued. That's almost the sort of the essence of what we're doing. And then, the reality of political agendas. And so we'll see how anyone's political agenda in state government could potentially impact what we're doing, but we do need to be aware of that. There's some work that's been done by some scholars that sort of looked across many different models for standards-based education and social studies across the country. And this is sort of what they saw as the most common sort of sequence of what happened. First was the content-driven scope and sequence. We have part of that. We have a scope and sequence in Connecticut. There are some elements of content, although obviously that's what we're trying to enhance, and that's connected then to related skills. And we have a lot of those related skills where we connect into aspects of the C3 framework and the inquiry model. That then leads into content standards, which is sort of where we're heading. And then what I think, and Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, what we won't be doing here, but what some states then do is look at benchmarks and performance standards I don't think that's what we'll be doing here. And then assessments. So I think we're going to be dealing with this first part. But and I don't know if at any point, Steve, you're going to want to talk about the other two. So for writing standards, I mean, the first thing I had is what was already brought up is we need to consider who the audience is. There are multiple audiences, and Steve has suggested that school districts and perhaps we have quite a few K-12 or 7-12 socialized coordinators on the call with us today. I think they're obviously a prime audience. But the question is, like, how are we keeping K-12 students in mind? How are we keeping teachers in mind? What are some of the other audiences? And the things I'm bringing up here, I'm hoping will, as we get into the meat of doing this, we'll have to think about these things. I think it's important to ask what knowledge is of most worth and whose knowledge is of most worth. And those are not the same thing. And then, from our work with the frameworks, we found that having very clear directives, like this is our narrow task, here are the boundaries of our task, and here are our timelines, was what really helped us to be successful. And I think an interesting question to ask is, how do we avoid spending all of our time explaining the standards rather than supporting the implementation? So thinking about how the standards are going to be received, thinking about how we're communicating those standards. So Ian mentioned some of the negative reviews of state standards where they were either overly complicated to use or not clear. And so I think that's an important aspect that we'll need, like how are we organizing these standards and how will they be used? So I'm not, this is going to be a really tough one. I believe that maybe the starting point is for us to be thinking about what is the main purpose of teaching social studies. Is it citizenship education or global citizenship education? Is it human rights? And within that, what's the balance between skills and content? Ian talked about the Fordham Foundation being more heavily content focused. Right now with our frameworks, we're more skills focused. But I don't know if we can come to a clear agreement or if we can at least have some core purpose that we agree on, because that really should be driving everything we're doing. If we're just haphazardly writing U.S. standards and world history standards and elementary standards without having a core purpose, we may end up in very different places. An issue that has not been brought up really too much yet is the different potential needs of elementary versus secondary. And some of that is, do elementary and secondary teachers need different things? Obviously the students do, but then also how is their alignment? So if we're doing some different things, the elementary and the secondary level, well, for those people here who are the K-12 coordinators, you want to know how things are going to align as students move through from elementary to secondary. So I think that's something would also be important for us to discuss. So this, as several people have brought this up, either in talking or in the chat, I call it teachers as professionals, and this idea of flexibility versus dictating what and how to teach. My personal belief is that too often teachers are not treated as professionals. They're not treated as knowing the content and knowing their pedagogy, and especially I think those who are not in teaching and politicians and policymakers think teachers need to be told what to do. So on the spectrum of dictating to teachers what to do versus it's a free-for-all, Wild West, do whatever you want, I'm definitely closer to the, well, not the Wild West, but closer to it in terms of letting teachers be professionals and trusting teachers that they know what they're doing, with guidance, of course, from department chairs and colleagues and administrators, et cetera. Our frameworks shifted things a little bit to not just be about chronology, but we wrote in themes for each of the bands and for the different subject areas. And so I wonder if there will be some discussion around themes and roles, themes and chronology. We have a K-12 scope and sequence with the frameworks. And so another, I think, stumbling block we may come across is how do we integrate? How do we take the frameworks and create standards? I don't think you want two documents there, because then it's like, well, which one do we use? And it gets pretty easy to disregard the frameworks and just use, well, we got content and the standards, we'll use that. So how do we take the standards and, the frameworks, excuse me, and build on them? And how do we not get tongue twisted and we're going back and forth between talking about frameworks and standards? I thought it'd be interesting to mention with the frameworks, probably the two biggest issues we faced in terms of debating what we wanted to do was, one, how to divide up US history. And so the decision was made to have early US history in 5th grade, and then 8th grade continues as, Revolution or Civil War, and high school follows that. But that was a really, I don't want to say it was contentious, but it was a long-winded debate on what to do. And I don't know if that's something that we'll revisit or will come up again. And the other was what to do with world history. And there were sort of those who really wanted to make sure ancient history was still covered, and those who wanted to have more connections to today. And of course, we ended up having the 6th and 7th grade banded global studies, where you study different regions of the world, and you might do some ancient and you would do some modern. So those were the two debates that came up with the frameworks. I don't know how that'll play out, but I thought that'd be interesting to talk about. And we're all familiar with that breadth versus depth, and that's really why with US history, we ended up splitting it up so there could be the depth. But if we're talking about content and what to include, everyone's going to have things they want to put in there. And at some point, obviously, it becomes too much. And so, going back to what are our goals for social studies education? How do we think about the breadth versus depth dilemma? I also thought it was interesting. There's a great article with some folks, it just came out a couple years ago. Some folks looked at how social studies standards were being developed and what the outcomes were. And what they said essentially is that standards, rarely do the new standards challenge the status quo of how or what history is taught. And an exact quote from them, the standards in multiple states failed to include reference to content beyond the scope of traditional knowledge, values, and intentions of conservative social studies. And by conservative, they don't mean liberal conservative, but they mean sort of sticking with what has happened. And even they were looking at standards that included lots of lists that people would classify as diversity, but it really wasn't changing how things were being taught, and particularly whose knowledge was being taught. And so, sort of as related to that, and there's Steve presenting the frameworks to a group of teachers. But I think I'm preaching to the choir here about we need to be thinking about what perspectives are included and left out, what voices are included and left out. But how are we going to? It's easy to say this. It's another thing to really think about what knowledge and whose knowledge are we going to include, and how are we going to do that in a way that's meaningful and not just lists of things that teachers can cover. We'll need to think about how we embrace difficult history and controversial issues. Obviously, right now, critical race theory is what is causing controversy. These standards will hopefully last long beyond that, and we need to think about that. And then this is my personal piece here, which is ignoring what sort of outside ideological groups are saying. And for me, the litmus test is always, what is the best thing for our K through 12 students, and what will best meet the needs of our teachers? And so, whichever piece of this I help with, that's the question I always like to try to bring to the group. So hopefully that was helpful in just putting some ideas out there and some things for us to think about moving forward. And I do think some of these will be issues we'll need to work through before we can start some actual writing.
Would anybody have questions or comments about to Alan or about Alan? Lauren?
Thanks, Alan. I just wanted to kind of raise one piece that Alan brought up, where he said, are we going to look at benchmarks? And I wonder a little bit about the incorporation of more language that would support teachers around areas of assessment, right? Because these standards that are in our existing document are just that, they're standards, right? And so incorporating some language, as I was listening to Alan talk, I was thinking about the actual standards with can-do statements and things that are in more student-friendly language around some of the things that students will know or be able to do, as a result of some of their work around those particular standards with a teacher, along with the flexibility of teachers to take ownership of how they get students to those pieces. I know we're not driving in the direction of having a state social studies test or anything like that, but I do often hear that feedback from teachers around the assessment of a standard and what things look like when they're written in a grade level band. What does that look like for a 6th grader, a 7th grader, an 8th grader as they progress through skills related to, say, gathering evidence? What would we, kind of mark for some of those pieces? So I think that that's really important. And then to the kind of different voices and historical perspective taking pieces, I think some of that language could also be incorporated into more student friendly language around how students might engage with different historical perspectives, take historical perspectives, and what that looks like developmentally as students engage with more increasingly complex content and issues as they progress through their K-12 or pre-K-12.
Yeah, so thanks, Lauren. So maybe I actually have a follow-up question then, not necessarily for you, but I know, I'm not sure if I can catch everyone here. Mary and Eileen and Jessica and Sarah, I'm just looking at some of the K-12 or 7-12 coordinators I see. I'm wondering from your perspective, is that assessment piece something that's done at the state level? Or do you see it as we take the state's basic state standards and then we would develop the assessment support for our district and what we're trying to do?
So I think that's kind of the question that I have around, embedding into any kind of document. Should we think about language that would help districts think about their assessment moving forward? I think we're definitely going to want to have local control, and I have some of that developed in my district already, right? Language around what we would expect for each grade level that's embedded in our rubrics and our assessment documents. But I think it's an important thing to consider when we think about the whole state. So I think that's what I was just I don't have an answer, but I was, when you said, are we going to talk about benchmarks? I thought that was an important question to think about here, because I do think that some districts, I know even especially K-5 is always asking me about language embedded in report card language and narrative feedback and things of that nature that might assist teachers in thinking about what does it look like for students at this particular grade level.
I think Carolyn has a comment, and then Alan, I'd like you to address the comment in the chat there, if you wouldn't mind after that. Carolyn, please.
Thanks, Steve. So there are 3 things I want to say. I'll say them as quickly as possible. First, I do take a little issue with this whole notion of prescriptive versus Wild West. I need to ensure, and it is my job to ensure, that our children have a consistent experience no matter who their teacher is, and that their experience in that class is as rich and as deep as it possibly can be. That being said, in this day and age, what we get from the state is critically important when I am under fire every single month in a Board of Ed meeting. So the more that the state can provide in terms of, we want you to teach our children about race and racism. We do want to see different perspectives, is going to provide us as a district with better ways to have conversations with our community about what we are and are not teaching. Because like it or not, there is a political agenda and it is invading our public school system, and it's sitting on my board. And I want to ensure that every child sees themselves reflected in our curriculum. So I think that we do have to pay attention to that. I would also like to suggest that all of the standards that were explored around this around the country are very linear, and that we could probably take a nice page out of the NGSS when we're talking about content versus performance expectations versus cross-disciplinary. Because if you start trying to write one standard in one statement, you're going to come up with a document that's pretty unusable. So how might we look at the frameworks, which are dimensional, and creating standards that are as dimensional as that document?
I want to say something because I think Caroline and I are both coming from a similar, I'm from an alliance district as well. And we have people in our leadership that are interested. You know, there's a lot of districts where teachers feel that, you know, that even though the research says instructional time spent on social studies is actually better for reading achievement, there are some places where the prevailing wisdom is that social studies isn't happening. It's those of you who know me know I'm looking at this question in terms of the alliance districts in Connecticut for my dissertation study, and we are, you know, finding that I think districts really need this document to support them in creating teacher-centered implementation cycles, so that the curriculum leader doesn't have to be like obsessed with social studies like some of us that are sitting in this committee are, to also counter some of the concerns that might be the prevalent wisdom. And I think that is one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about as I reflect and get to know how different districts have done their implementation cycles.
I think there's well, let me go back to Caroline first, and I think this, as someone else wrote, this is maybe our most difficult dilemma that we have to deal with. And I think we're going to be providing specific content in the standards. The question is how districts use it, and what does the state say? The example is the new African American Latinx history course that's being offered has a specific curriculum, and teachers are being told you need to sort of implement that. And there's a lot of teachers that are not so happy that they want more flexibility. And so I think my message was we need to trust that our teachers are professionals, and figure out how do we provide them with content, but let that if I'm in Hartford, I may be including more Puerto Rican history, and I'm in Danbury, I may be doing more with Brazilian history based on the context and who my students are, and that's what I'm saying when there needs to be flexibility. But the other thing that looked like was coming through in the chat was this idea of there may really be some significant differences between what happens at the elementary level and the secondary level, and there was I'm trying to read through these quickly here, but there was a suggestion maybe that needs in K8 or K6 there needs to be more spelled out or more prescriptive is what was one of the words that was used. And I mean, look, there was a time a number of years ago, Hartford just got rid of social studies in their curriculum, and then they brought it back, right, Eileen? I see Eileen looking, and now they brought it back. But that's definitely an issue as social studies at the elementary level and how it gets included or not. So, I mean, everyone's bringing up great points, and Stephen and Tony, I don't know what your plan is. Obviously, a group this big to talk through these issues would not be easy. But at the same time, once we split up and there's groups working on elementary and there's groups working on US history and world history, how do we have some common understanding about what our goals are and what the purpose of social studies is, and some of the other issues that have been brought up. So that's your job, not my job. My job is to bring stuff to make your job difficult. So
could I just say that we have to create guiding principles, and before we break into any groups, those have to be firmly put into place. that
Yeah, so-
that answering some of these questions have to be answered before we move into any group work whatsoever.
Yeah, and thanks for making things a little bit more difficult for us, Alan. I really do appreciate that. Just to kind of try to untangle the knot. It's actually something I enjoy to do or enjoy doing. But this week we're actually meeting with the project associates to deal with this specifically. So as you know, we've been moving very quickly through this process. This is our second meeting over all meetings, and then we'll be meeting with the project associates this week to start to work through developing those guiding principles. And then we're going to meet again the week of December 13 to kind of flesh that out a little bit further. And then we'll be committing to that at the beginning of the year before we break out into the writing groups. So just to give you a little overview of how that's going to work.
So foolishly, I thought that we could have Alan could speak and then we would have 3 presentations in an hour. How'd that work out for us? We've got 23, because I value your time. So we will do 2 of the presentations next time. Jen, why don't we go with you to
All
start?
right, and thank you, Jessica and Caroline. I want to just introduce myself. My name is Jen Murray. I currently am the Assistant Superintendent of Curriculum and Instruction in East Haven Public Schools. But throughout the journey since 2015, I have served as a district level social studies curriculum specialist. I've worked at ACES to support different districts' implementation, and I'm currently studying implementation of the frameworks in Alliance districts in my dissertation. So I'm bringing probably more than the district perspective. So I want to start there because Caroline's work and Jessica's work, I'm sure at the district level will really highlight a lot of the standard stuff, but if I have to skimp, I'll skimp on that because there's so much good stuff happening. But I kind of shifted my slides around a little bit as we were talking to think about the broad lessons learned from different implementation strategies. And I hope that's okay, but I think it works with what we've been trying to do. So East Haven, we are an Alliance district. We have 4 elementary schools. We have 1 internal magnet school, a middle school, and a high school. And we have a diverse population and a number of English language learners. And so just very quickly, I want to talk to you about the things that came up as roadblocks. And, it speaks to what Alan was talking about and what most of our individuals will talk about is shifting mindsets on how people learned history was a really important part of the work that went into implementing the frameworks. And supporting elementary teachers specifically. My 612 team were eating this stuff up. They wanted it. They had tons of inquiry, knowledge base at the curriculum level, but in some Connecticut educator preparation programs, it was a science and social studies methods course that was mixed. So their limits to their methodology in terms of teaching social studies required a lot of training, and we saw different approaches throughout the state as far as how much training people got. And I'm interested in right now, my study is looking at how much time people spent, what implementation looked like. So stay tuned, I'll tell you a little bit more about what I find out. But what we found was when training was input, when people had implementation supports, there were some work groups for curriculum leadership. So people that are like-minded. I know Mary and I got together quite a bit. Caroline and I got together quite a bit. I'm sure there's other people I'm forgetting about, but those of us that were thinking through these questions in different settings, who had classroom experience and were bringing teachers into that conversation. And we also found that, giving teacher input and insight allowed some of the things that Melissa's talking about, which allowed for embedded curriculum and clear definitions and outcomes. So I followed predominantly in East Haven, if you're familiar with the National Implementation Research Network, there's an exploration stage. And I think, Tony, it's fair to say you're doing this too. We're exploring. You've had your associates really look at different standards and what they're doing. But I'm going to talk a little bit about it through kind of our process since 2015 in East Haven. But I'll share with you a logic model that to see, and again, I will fully disclose that the COVID implemented years, 3 and 4 of this. So it's not quite where I want it to be, but we really thought about the planned work and inputs and measured kind of thinking and understanding staff capacity. So that was a really important part of any successes that we had. And our teachers had to have their voices on board. And this is just when we were talking about just recently, because this is a recursive cycle, when people are talking about how worried they are about the pandemic and how we want people to, well, I don't have time to teach social studies. We really go back to basics of our why. Why are we teaching social studies? And I'm speaking particularly about the elementary level. We want people to understand their community, their world, be nicer to each other. It's all the social emotional learning stuff. And sometimes those boards that Caroline talks about are needing to sort of be brought back. And so when I talk about implementation, I'm talking about our standards document needs, you know, what we did in 2015, we had a clear description. So Steve is talking about what are our guiding principles? What is this meant to do? Prescriptive or not, all of those questions are going to be decided by this group. We had created in 2015 these different documents that outline the essential functions. And then finally, we had a performance assessment in East Haven that we used to see the curriculum. What was a frameworks? What's an indicator? What's a standard? So we at the district level defined those operational. The state did some webinars to help us define the inquiry arc. And so that was part of the work that went into this. But at the district level, we had some measures that helped us understand, are we culturally responsive? Did we check with certain groups? Were the special ed and the ESL teachers represented on our curriculum writing process? So those pieces were really important. And so in our exploration stage for our younger grade teachers, we wanted them to have some experience that might have been more like a methods course because they may have lacked some of that. And so they engaged as learners in some inquiry activities. We talked about our goals, but one thing that's really important is that we sold the idea that increased instructional time in social studies, but not in ELA. This is my study that I'm citing a lot, is actually related with greater reading growth. So the people who are saying we don't have time to teach social studies in elementary school really need the state and our guide to make sure this is really clear. What does that look like, especially in the younger grades, that can support teachers who, like Melissa and like Mary's teachers, have this dynamic interest in making it really engaging when you may be working in a district where there's this pressure and a lot of kids who are struggling with reading. And so I don't want to go too much into this. Some of these slides, but we talked about the research and got the why together. And we really focused on helping our teachers understand the difference between big ideas and essential questions. And so I'm gonna skip a little bit because I want to just get to some of the meat of helping teachers understand what the example outlined in the frameworks was, for example, explain the benefits and costs of trade policies to individuals, businesses, and society. Our teachers really were part of the process to unpack those and understand what they need to know, understand, and do to be able to show and in a measurable way that they get this, that they understand this. And so we operationally define some classroom models, and in the interest of time, another concept at the elementary level that was very concerning was people felt overwhelmed by feeling like they had to have some, work through the textbook, day after day, or teach US history to 1865 in 5th grade. So we developed to start early on some mentor text, social studies concept mentor text lesson to really clarify the difference between a literacy lesson and a social studies lesson. That was part of our initial implementation. And we tried to make it work by defining a unit per trimester, because in East Haven, we have trimesters. And we felt that these units also connected with our science. For example, our science landforms was very highly connected with US regions, and they learned about landforms in the way that regions developed. It was the same with our economics, with industry and innovation. They looked at Connecticut simple machines. So as a lot of people were talking about, our teachers had those ideas in their head, and we brought them together with some of the content to say, how can we make this fit? And so we used our Atlas curriculum management system. I think another component that we took the frameworks and had the benefit of some of the consulting that our tribal communities engaged with us to bring some of those conversations and the Native 360 guidance to provide teachers with embedded professional learning within the units of like, what are the sticking points when people were going to have some struggles with, like, do I say Indians? Do I say Native Americans? What do I say? So we gave them some information on nomenclature and being more tribal focused. And just so those kinds of things, and providing them with the unit document. And so this goes back to making sure that we are taking our standards and helping students develop that vocabulary. And so again, those interdisciplinary connections allowed for us to, embed things with practices in science, looking at models. And we also received a lot of feedback from our ESL community, identifying the academic vocabulary that would need to be supportive of students as they were engaging in content. And so I just, a lot of the thinking that we did was around how do we measure the quality of our curriculum? So we relied a lot on a culturally responsive curriculum scorecard and designing for transfer and academic rigor. This is a C3 framework rubric. And we decided to do a case study approach because we wanted things that were engaging to students, relevant to our local vision of the graduate, and competencies that students will need in their lives and society, and that were in service to standards. And so you might think about, what are you choosing? And so, for example, the Global Encounters unit in 5th grade, when we were making decisions about content, and this goes back to what we've been talking about with, why did the state do a Black and Latino studies curriculum? One, because the capacity for teachers greatly varies. And what's the detriment of that is if a teacher is like, but my kids can't do that. Those of us in curriculum leadership positions have amazing, wonderful, dynamic teachers. And we also hear some people that say, but that's too hard for my kids. They need to know their states and capitals, and we're going to do that. Like, we do have to sort of support the teachers that are doing this. So we provided time and reflection to identify case studies that were indicative of, for example, are kids learning in 5th grade the first time they ever learn about people representing an African American is during the study of slavery? Or can they learn about the Kingdom of Mali and how Timbuktu became a center of learning and trade? And that becomes a part of a unit that tells a different story about the African experience than just the slave trade, right? We want kids to grapple with challenging things so thinking about the science of history. And so those competencies, I think, are driving some of how we translated the frameworks into sort of district level standards. And then we tried to come up with, certain concepts that we felt were operationalizing very difficult things, especially at the elementary level for economics. People were like, I can't teach economics, I'm an elementary teacher, but really making it palatable for them by giving simple operational definitions was very helpful. And then full implementation, thinking about document-based questions where kids would write, incorporate knowledge of images that were primary sources that had local significance and wherever possible connected to our science curriculum. So this is an example of a document-based question for East Haven Public Schools. This is an example for a very young grade where they just are using the See, Think, Wonder to look at a picture of a field trip when they explore the past. So a lot of our elementary folks got really scared about, what does it look like? What do you mean primary source documents? But when people can see these examples, so I do think these visuals and examples, as some of our previous folks noted, were very important. And so later on, we engaged in some work protocols and did some scoring calibration, and that largely was put on the wayside when COVID hit, but I think that work would be very, very impactful. And so I don't want to talk anymore. I'm happy to hear if anybody has any questions. There is way too much in a body of work of 6 years to cover in a few slides, but I tried to stay at the level of like what lessons we learned from implementation so that we can drive our guiding principles. Because again, the caution is if it's not in the sweet spot, if it's too loose, people who are not feeling like kids can handle it might be inclined to stick with status quo, and we might lose potential of really changing and supporting kids deeply engaging in what we know is good for them.
Carol, thank you, Jennifer. Appreciate it, greatly appreciate it. Carolyn and Jessica, we're going to give you time next time, but I would want you to have at least 2 minutes each just to add whatever you think is appropriate. Carolyn, I see you have your hand up, so go ahead.
So I just want to say thank you, Jen, because that was the single biggest opportunity that we had with our teachers, was the mindset that they could not do it. And there's nothing more satisfying and just redeeming about kids rising to a high level of expectation. We have third graders reading primary documents, Columbus's journals, and coming up with really incredible conclusions based in the content and knowledge that they're learning. And so helping our teachers to see that and to give them the confidence that they can teach this content and they can assess at high levels has really pushed our students forward.
Jessica?
Well, my my perspective is much narrower. I only have experience, at the 9-12 level. So that was really, I really enjoyed seeing more of that K-12. And so, I look forward when I can share what our district has gone through. I will be able to share a little more of a narrow secondary view, which will be like a nice contrast. And a lot of what we went through and a lot of what we followed was really laid out by Alan earlier. So that really felt good hearing what he was saying as starting points, because a lot of that is what we went through. So hopefully, some of what I can share, this group can use moving forward when we think about, the state level. And that's it.
Thank you. And certainly these conversations, to state the obvious, will be continued. Tony, do you want to wrap up talking about next steps and things?
Sure. Thank you so much. Please be on the lookout for an email. Probably tomorrow, maybe Wednesday at the latest. Again, we're trying to look to see what people think their role will be in this process. Also, I just put into the chat a doodle poll. If you could fill that out so we can get the next the next meeting on your calendar as soon as possible. And then again, our next steps is that we're going to be meeting with the the project associates this week on Wednesday to kind of unpack what we learned today and determine what the next steps are going to be forward so that we could set our guiding principles. And then shortly after that, we'll be getting going with the writing of the standards. So, and I know there's been some discussion about standards versus curriculum and content and how much prescription. Please be aware that we will be developing a model curriculum after the standards are written, right? So we're only working on standards right now until June. And then following that, there'll be some work to be done on developing a model curriculum. So that's where we're going to be able to get into a lot of the nitty gritty of what does it look like in the classroom. So right now we're at a very much higher level. And to the point about the frameworks, the frameworks are going to be a guide. To Alan's point, it's not going to say which document you're going to look at. The standards document is going to be based on the work that we did with the framework. So there won't be too much, I hope there won't be too much of a learning curve when we roll out the standards, because we'll already be aligned with the frameworks, which have been out since 2015. Other than that, that's all I really have for today. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us for these 90 minutes. Please complete that doodle poll in the chat, and I will send out this video and the doodle poll to your email when we're asking about what you'd like your role to be in the next coming months. I think that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good day.